כן, כן,
ברשותך,
בטח.
אני מתחילה, בסדר? יופי. אז ערב טוב לכולם.
הנה. רגע, קיצור. רגע. אולי תישאר.
אני שמחה להיות כאן, ואני שמחה בפניכם את המורה שלנו, שלי ושל הילה, או של הילה ושלי ושל איידי וולרי ורות, בתוכנית מחנכות שמגיעה בימים אלה, אני מקווה לסיומה. למדנו הרבה מאוד מאלן, ואני רק אומר את חלק משבחו שלו בפניו. אני כן אומר, מבחינת ההכשרה שלו, אז הוא מחנך מטעם ה-ACPE, שעלה לארץ ב-2014, מעבר לכך שיש לו תואר דוקטורט בתיאולוגיה של הליווי הרוחני מאוניברסיטת NYU, יש לו תואר שני גם מקולומביה במדיניות ציבורית, וגם תואר שני מ-JTS בתלמוד. ומעבר לזה הוא באמת מורה שמחבר בצורה יוצאת מן הכלל תיאוריה ומעשה, ומדריך שרואה לעומק, ואני מאוד שמחה, אני בטוחה שהילה מצטרפת אליי להזדמנות הזאת שהוא איתנו הערב, והוא ידבר באנגלית, ואני בטוחה שאפשר לשאול בעברית אם צריך. אלן, בבקשה, ערב טוב וברוך הבא, ואני מקווה שזה ביטוי להמשך ההשתתפות שלך לקיחת חלק והנחיה ממש בעמותה.
תודה טובה, תודה לכולם. So I do apologize, but I am going to speak באנגלית, but I'm very glad to see you all and to be here. So Tova and Dina asked me to talk a little bit about the conflict that all of us feel, all of us Livui Ruchani feel when we work with our mitupalim around our own agenda and what they want. And then sometimes there's also the agenda of medical staff, and the agenda of family members, and the conflicts between all these things come up, especially around big medical decisions, around death. So I wanted to introduce to you a couple of frameworks that can help us to navigate this tension, this conflict that we all feel. So I've used Zoom a lot in the past, but I have not taught with Zoom. So we'll see how I do with using Zoom as a teaching tool. I'm going to try and share my screen now, because I do have a PowerPoint presentation, which should take about an hour, maybe less, and then we'll have some time to talk. So can people see my presentation? Is it should be loading?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'll go right into the presentation. So like I said before, Tova and Dina asked me to talk about some tensions in Livui Ruchani, in particular, the tensions between our agenda as Melavim Ruchanim and the agenda of the Mitupalim. And this also made me think of some other tensions, some other conflicts that I think are parallel in many ways that we face in our work, and that share a lot with this particular tension. So there's also the tension between the spiritual and the psychological. And in CPE as it was formed, 100 or so years ago, originally, people talked about this as the tension between religion and science. And CPE was originally understood as an attempt to integrate religion and science. There's also the tension between being present to our mitupalim and making an assessment. And I'll talk at some length about what I mean by an assessment. And then there's also the tension between the cognitive versus the affective, which is just another way of saying between thinking and feeling. And sometimes people talk about head versus heart. So my agenda for today is to look at two tools for helping us navigate the tension between our agenda and that of the mitupal. One tool from the social sciences, and that's going to be a tool for spiritual assessment, and one tool from the realm of spirituality and religion. Like I said, the first is spiritual assessment, which is, a lot of things that we have, in Livui Ruchani and CPE in particular are things that we borrowed from the medical sciences. So spiritual assessment is kind of an attempt to adapt into our realm the kind of assessment that medical professionals and social work professionals have long done. And one thing that spiritual assessment does is it can help us to clarify, to distinguish between what is our agenda and what is the agenda of the mitupal. And the second tool that I'm going to look at is prayer. We don't always talk about prayer as a tool, but I'm going to think about it that way for the purposes of this discussion. And I'm going to think of prayer as a way of expressing our agenda for the mitupal and the agenda of the mitupal for his or herself. Now, I know that doesn't express everything about what tefillah means to all of us, but that's the sort of piece of the whole world of prayer that I'm going to talk about today as a way of expressing the agenda of the mitupal in particular. And at the end, I'm going to seek to unify, to bring all these things together in a way that also unifies our agenda and that of the mitupal. And this is an approach that I call shared hopes. Shared hopes. I'll talk about what I mean by that. So what is spiritual assessment? Spiritual assessment is just, at its simplest level, it's just a way of assessing, of determining, of measuring what the spiritual listing may be, what the spiritual needs and resources of the mitupal are. What strengths they have, what spiritual resources they have. Do they have some kind of faith community, some kind of belief, some kind of source of meaning? And what are their needs? What are their spiritual needs in this moment when they meet them? In particular, if we meet them in a time of crisis. And what spiritual assessment helps us to do is to plan an agenda, plan our agenda for how we're going to take care of the mitupal. And sometimes we use the language of interventions for that, to decide what our interventions are with the mitupal. It's a way of structuring it. The basic form that we, again, borrow from medicine and social work is, contact, assessment, and then plan. Contact is just what did I see when I met the mitupal? How do I assess what I saw? And what am I going to do as a result of that? That's my plan. Those are my interventions. And then if we really have a full spiritual assessment going, then we, at the end, evaluate, measure our interventions, our plan, to see whether we've been able to achieve some of what we hope to with the mitupal. Were we able to help them or accompany them or help them to change in the ways we were hoping? There are many, many, many different types of spiritual assessment. I'm sure most of you have encountered some types of spiritual assessment in your training. And one that some of you have seen, I'm not going to spend any time explaining this, but the folks at Hebrew Senior Life, or some of you have trained, have tried to put together a framework for spiritual assessment that uses categories from Judaism. They have 7 of them. A lot of frameworks for spiritual assessment have 7 categories. There's something about the number 7 that people both inside the Jewish tradition and outside the Jewish tradition love. It's a special number. But so the spiritual assessment framework that I'm going to talk about in particular is a relatively recent one called AIM, and I think AIM just stands for, I actually forget, but I think it stands just for Assessment Intervention Method or something like that. I just call it AIM, and I'll talk a little bit about why I like it. It's very similar to previous methods, but I like some of the refinements in it. It was developed by a person by the name of Michelle Shields, who's an ACPE certified educator who's worked for many, many years at the University of California, San Francisco in San Francisco. There's an article which I could share a copy of with anyone who wants it, that they published in 2014 in a palliative care journal about how they came up with this method and how they think about it as a wonderful grid to use to understand it. Very clear. And I don't know, some of you may know Alison Kestenbaum, who's a Jewish ACPE certified educator. She was a co-author with Michelle Shields. She worked with and trained under Michelle Shields there at UCSF. So AIM is based on the assumption that relationships are the context for a person's spiritual development. And it comes out of this, very well-known theory in psychology called object relations. And that can help us object relations was designed to help us understand human relationships, but we can also use to think about a person's relationship with the holy, about the parallels between a person's thinking about the authority of a father or other parent and the authority of the holy, whether a person has a belief in God or not. So object relations posits that the internal drama of childhood, the basics, drama that a person experiences in childhood, especially with key figures, again, like parents, becomes expressed again in future relationships. What object relations means is that, just the word is that these formative figures like parents kind of become something, an object in your head, and you replay the same sort of scripts, the same sort of dramas that you had in childhood with other people come into your life, like significant others. So thus, a person who experienced abandonment and neglect in relationships from childhood may develop a primary spiritual need to feel loved by the divine. And this language of primary spiritual need is very key in this AIM spiritual assessment framework. That the framework, as we shall see, posits that there are 3 main types of spiritual needs that people have, and this leads to some set behaviors and calls for a particular kind of response from the Midlava Ruchani. And what I really love about AIM, it's something that I saw for the first time, I haven't seen in other spiritual assessment frameworks, and I'll talk about this, as an idea of embodiment, that it has a way of thinking about how our embodied feelings, the feelings we have when we're in contact with a mitupal, how that affects our, how we can determine what their primary spiritual needs are. And then it also thinks about how we respond in terms of embodiment. It thinks about how we respond in terms of trying to be a particular kind of person for each, as the milaveh, for each kind of spiritual needs. So we'll see a little bit about what I mean by that. So there are three roles that come out of these three different primary spiritual needs. We'll see all this in more detail, but the three roles are either guide, valuer, or truth teller. So the first of these three primary spiritual needs is the need for self-worth or belonging. So the response that this calls out for in the milaveh is to be a valuer or a source of community for the mitupal. So what kind of behaviors might we observe from a person who has this kind of primary spiritual need? And if you take a look at the article I mentioned earlier, there's a much longer list of what kind of behaviors you might see for each of these spiritual needs. But I just picked out enough of them that would fit on a PowerPoint slide. So the first is that the person who has this kind of need might blame themselves for what's happening. I'm responsible for why I'm sick. I made all kinds of mistakes. If I had exercised more, I wouldn't have heart disease, and so it's really my fault. This person is unlikely to complain about their current circumstances. It's very easy when we have a person like this to miss that they have spiritual needs, because they might sound like they have no needs, because they sound satisfied. They're like, well, the doctors are good, the nurses are good, the staff is good. They might talk only about concern for others, but not about concern for themselves. And this is something to notice when you have somebody who only talks about their concern for others, but not about themselves. And they might accept the current reality without question. So how might you feel as the milaveh? What might your body tell you, your feelings tell you when you're around a person like this? So you might feel like the mitupal is trying to take care of you. I think I found this a lot, when I was working in the States with young seminary students, seminary students in their 20s, they would, which is a different population than the folks we have here today. But they would often come back, feeling like, from an encounter with a patient in a hospital bed, feeling like the mitupal was trying to take care of them. You might feel that the mitupal is putting you on a pedestal, thinks you're so wonderful and perfect. And again, it's easy to miss the primary spiritual need here, because these things can feel so good to us, somebody telling us how wonderful we are. And we should allow ourselves to feel good about that, but we should also be curious whether, they're saying nice things to us is reflecting they actually have this need for self-worth and belonging. So who might you try and be? Again, this idea of embodiment is about the body. Who might you try and be for a person like this? Well, you might try and be a valuer or community for them. You might help them to try and surface, to actually get in touch with whatever anger they have, and show them that anger is safe. We like to use the language of holding their anger, showing it's okay for them to have it, that it's not necessarily dangerous. You can help them to get in touch with, to surface unhealthy beliefs about the self, and help them see the ways that they are worthy and they are lovable. You can do this through making statements of affirmation, and you can try and create a community for them, a community of two, and maybe link them to a community. So what are you hoping is going to happen if you embody this role, this value or community role with this kind of person? So some of the outcomes that you might see, and again, this is partially the evaluation stage. How am I going to evaluate that what I'm doing, my plan of embodying this role is making progress? What can I tell people? What can I tell people, on the care team? What can I tell social workers or nurses about what my time is accomplishing with this person? Well, maybe they can, if they report a greater sense of belonging to a community, that might be something you've been able to help them to reach. You might see that they're more able to name ways that they can address their own needs. And you might see that they behave and speak in ways that indicate enhanced self-worth. So this is the first of these three primary spiritual needs under the AIM framework. The second is when somebody has a need for meaning and direction, when a person in some way feels lost. And for this person, we can be a kind of guide. What do we observe with a person like this? We might observe that they don't blame others, that they intellectualize their circumstances, maybe they talk a lot. Sometimes you come across people who talk a lot about what's happening in the world at large. They want to talk about the news a lot. They might be concerned with the meaning of life and illness. A lot of times people want to talk to us about these kinds of things. They might have difficulty focusing and making decisions. And they might ask you a lot of questions. They might, want to know what, they might ask you questions about what God is, or what illness is, or why is this happening? So how might you feel if you're around a person who is in need of meaning for direction like this? Well, you might feel in a fog. Like you're in a cloud. You might find yourself getting confused or even sleepy or bored. So this is something to notice, that if you do feel, sleepy or bored with a mitupal, and maybe you're even feeling some self-judgment about that, I'm a bad mileveh ruchani because I can't pay attention to this person, because I can't stay awake. Maybe maybe you should get more sleep, but it can also be an indication that you're working with a person who has this kind of primary spiritual need. So how do you embody this guide, this role of guide, of madrich? Well, you might name and reflect back emotions, especially anger. You might be able to surface details about the decisions to be made. You might be able to help them to break down into pieces these decisions that feel so overwhelming to them. This is the kind of person where it might be helpful to ask questions like, well, what's the worst that can happen? Or questions like, well, what would the first step be? And then when the mitupal is able to make decisions, to celebrate those decisions with them. And the desired outcomes with a person like this would include that you might be able to find, you might be able to document, to write down, to record, to report that a person is more able to make decisions. And ones, this is important, ones that fit, that are matim with their the values of the mitupal, that they're not your values, that they're the mitupal's values. You can help them to identify their hopes and desires. Again, it helps with somebody like this to ask the questions like, these sort of what's the most kind of questions. What's the thing you hope for most? What do you desire most? Or alternatively, what's the worst thing that can happen? What are you most afraid of? And if they do become less anxious, especially around making decisions, that's something you can observe. So finally, the third spiritual need under this AIM framework, and this is one, at least for, people that people in our field that I know in the States that we can be most reluctant to adopt, this role of truth teller or of Navi, this sort of prophetic kind of role, to call people on their, stuff, if you will. so this is a person who, is in need of some kind of reconciliation, maybe some kind of tshuva, a need to love and be loved. So you might, with a person like this, observe that they blame a lot. These can be very difficult people to be around. Sometimes we run away from mitapalim like this. They might blame people a lot. They might complain a lot, complaining about, medical staff, about their conditions, where they are. They might expect others to know what it is that they need, to just figure it out without them expressing it, to intuit their needs. They might not take any responsibility for their own choices or their own healing. They may be combative. They may feel angry. They may be angry all the time, and they may talk a lot about broken relationships. Whether they're romantic relationships or relationships with family, with children, parents. So what does it feel like to be around this kind of person? Well, you might feel triangulated. And what I mean by that is you might feel like the mitupal wants you to be on their side, to take their side in some kind of dispute. They might even ask you to. They might even say, can't you talk to my daughter about this, about what she's done? Or talk to the doctor. You might become, with this person, you might feel afraid yourself of alienating them. Maybe you want to, stay the good person in their, you want to continue to be liked by them. You don't want them to be angry at you like they're angry at everybody else. So you might feel afraid. So what do you do when you think you're working with a person like this? How do you become this truth teller? So one way is to tolerate the anger that they express. And again, use the language of holding this anger, being willing to listen to it, be non-reactive, just reflect it back, and maybe surface some of the helplessness that they feel beneath it. A lot of times anger has helplessness associated with. You might, this is hard, but you might be able to work towards holding the mitupal accountable for creating their own environment, including environments of safety and trust, and helping them identify ways that they are not helpless, ways that they can take greater control over their circumstances, over their relationships, over their life. And you can name for them what the impact of some of their behavior is, how it might be hurtful for them, or maybe even help hurtful for other people, and maybe even for the mitupal, maybe even for you as the milaveh. What are some of the desired outcomes with this kind of person? Well, it would be really great if you get to the point where they might be able to realize and name some of the impacts of their actions, and even more so, to get to a point of approaching real tshuva and being able to express remorse for wronging others and seeking forgiveness from them, and perhaps also from God. And perhaps they will experience some kind of reconciliation. So what are, we've been talking about this tool of spiritual assessment, in particular, this framework of AIM. What are some of the limitations of spiritual assessment? Well, there are a lot of them. We can talk maybe more about that later, but one is that it doesn't necessarily feel spiritual. You might be asking yourself, well, where's the holy in all of this? Isn't this just psychological? Isn't this just therapy? And it also, kind of turns the mitupal a little bit into an object that we act on, kind of puts us above them, you know, that maybe we feel like we're somebody who can actually cure them, or something like that. This is the problem with all assessment frameworks, that there's this danger of objectification. And it's really not a partnership, at least not as I think AIM actually can be modified to be more of a partnership with the Mitupal, but as it's expressed, it's really not. It's all sort of being done by the Milaveh. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the possibility of prayer, or a type of prayer, or a subset of prayer, a chelik of prayer, as a solution of tefillah. So again, I'm having a very broad definition of prayer here as an expression of the hopes, joys, and laments, you know, the sorrows of a person. And I'm just, you know, as I'm sitting here and I read hopes, joys, and laments, I think about Psalms and how, you know, Tehillim, and how Tehillim, you know, express all of these things. We can find hope, joy, and also a lot of lament in Tehillim. So I'll talk a little bit about Rabbi Bonita Taylor. She was a pioneering CP educator, Jewish CP educator, a method that she came up with for what she called custom-made prayers. Sometimes people talk about individualized prayers or spontaneous prayers, about, you know, making up a prayer in the moment for the Mitupal. And this is something that, you know, I think in general in the Jewish world that we become more comfortable with, though a lot of, you know, in general, Christians are more comfortable with this kind of method, though I think a lot of us in our field are pretty familiar with it by now. So, you know, she has a simple 5-part framework. You start by asking the person, and she would think about doing this at the end of the visit. And, you know, she's kind of thinking of a classic pastoral care visit where you have a discussion with the Mitupal, you talk about what's happening for them, you find out something about them, you find out what, you know, their laments are in this moment, something about what their resources are, maybe something about their family, something about who they care about, what they care about. And as you get towards the end of the visit, you might, you know, ask permission. Is it okay if I say a prayer, or would you like to pray with me? And Benita was really famous, maybe infamous, for requiring her CPE students to do this. You know, for Benita, it was not, for Benita with her students, it was not optional whether she asked, whether her students asked, her CPE students asked their Mitupalim whether they wanted to pray at the end of the visit. She required it. And this is what she, you know, what she asked people to do, to ask their Mitupalim to identify a focus in his or her body or spirit for the prayer, and to ask, where would you like to focus God's healing energy? You know, I would, you know, when I'm doing this sort of thing, I would be more likely to just ask somebody, is there something you'd like me to pray for? Or is there somebody you'd like me to pray for? Then the third step here is to address God and connect the person to God, mention the person's name. So to, you know, say something like, you know, Holy One, you know, I am here with Sarah. You know, I lift up Sarah to you, and, you know, and her concerns, and hope that you see them and care for her. And to then, you know, name in the prayer what the person's lament is. sing the blues, so to speak, relate the person's plight, the person's suffering, the person's complaints to God. And part of the power of this kind of technique is that it can help people who don't feel okay about complaining, if you've ever met one, that it's, to feel, some kind of affirmation about that it's okay to have these laments and complaints. And then, finally to share the person's hopes with God in the course of the spontaneous prayer. So what are some of the limitations of Bonita Taylor's method? I think, I think it sees the Mileveh primarily as kind of a technician. We might also say just like a channel or a pipe, a tzinor maybe for the needs and concerns, the hopes of the mitupal. So sort of just summarizing the person's, the mitupal's hopes, and not really, and all of that, I don't want to minimize that because being able to do that is a lot. But I also have this ambition of forming relationship, connection with the mitupal, and I think, I believe personally very strongly that means involving something of the person of ourselves, of our own hopes and concerns in the course of our encounter with this mitupal. And so I think it obscures, as part of what I was already saying, but I think it obscures the agenda of the Mileveh and the person, the soul of the Mileveh. So what do I propose as an alternative? I propose something that I call a shared hopes framework. So this is an idea for a prayerful, ongoing assessment. So by ongoing and prayerful, I mean that this is not just something you do at the end of a visit. This is something that you're doing throughout the entire visit. In a sense, it's an idea of praying continuously through the visit, as you listen to the person, as you hear the hopes and also the hopes and concerns, and also as you listen to yourself, your own hopes and concerns, and what you're, really, hoping for this person. That you take note in your head, mentally take note of these points of hope that correspond to the story of the mitupal and their concerns. By putting this in the language, and this is very similar. I call this a spiritual assessment. It's very similar in many ways to a spiritual assessment framework like AIM. But I use the language of prayer to emphasize the spiritual nature of this. And, part of what I think makes it spiritual in particular is the hard work, if we do it, the hard work while we're doing this of trying to find points of connection between our own hopes and the hopes of the mitupal. What could we honestly say, whether it's in a prayer or just in a prayerful statement at the end? What could we honestly say out loud to the mitupal about what we hope for them? And in this way, to take the risk of sharing something of ourselves with them, and not hiding from them, because we are tempted to hide ourselves very often, especially when we're with somebody who feels difficult to us in some way, or we feel that their hopes or agenda are unrealistic in some way. If they're hoping to live when we know they're not going to live much longer, what can we find where we really can join with them. So like I've written here, this doesn't necessarily have to be expressed out loud in the form of a prayer. It can be expressed at the end in the simplest of prayerful partings, just to say, I hope you get, good, if the doctor is going to come with some kind of news tomorrow, I hope you get good news tomorrow when the doctor comes, or I hope, that, I know you, really want to see your son or your daughter. I hope they're able to come tomorrow. And maybe it's just a mental intention. Maybe we don't even speak it out loud. I personally believe it's still of importance for us to form a mental intention, just a prayer for ourselves. So I've already been talking about this a little bit, but part of what I've been expressing is an idea of intersubjectivity, that to try as much as we can to think of the encounter between the Milaveh and the Mitupal not as two separate objects meeting, but as something that comes together, where something is created together. And so that's why the Milaveh should be searching for points of genuine overlap in the hopes and agenda that they have between them and the Mitupal. What can you genuinely say that you are both hoping for the Mitupal? And I really think of this continual, ongoing from the beginning of the visit to the end, genuinely searching for a shared hopes and agenda as a spiritual practice. And it's not easy. Again, especially if we find somebody difficult, or we find that we don't share with them something of the agenda. But I think it's an act of trying to create genuine relationship and community. So how does this compare with the AIM framework that I started with? So I think there's a parallel between what I call prayers and the desired outcomes as the last column in the AIM framework that I showed you. So in effect, I'm asking you to consider speaking out loud the desired outcomes, speaking out loud with the Mitupal, the desired outcomes as part of the AIM framework, to share them with the Mitupal, with this challenge to merge agendas. So, with a truth-telling example, if you're talking with a person who's in a conflict, maybe with an adult child, you might, with Benita Taylor's framework, you might start by sort of introducing yourself to God. Of course, you have to make an assessment about whether you're going to use God language with the person you're talking to. That's going to change depending on who you're working with. Say something about what sort of part of holiness you want to access. That you want to access peace and healing. This is something that you can genuinely express, that you want to access the holy ones as a source of peace and healing, even if you're not taking sides with the Mitupal against her daughter, against her child. Bring your healing to Sarah and her daughter here today. Let them know your peace. Let Sarah's words and hurt be heard. That's something I think it's pretty easy to genuinely believe, that you want the person to be heard, even if you're not agreeing with them, even if you're not taking their side. And may the two of them and all people find healing from that which tears them apart. I'd like to, I like to conclude, all of my prayers with a broader hope for the world at large, for a hope for healing and for shalom. Kind of modeling on how the Amidah ends with a prayer for shalom. So, in conclusion, spiritual assessment and prayer are two powerful ways of hearing the concerns, the feelings, the laments of the Mitupal, and seeking ways of responding to those needs and concerns. AIM is a particularly important contribution in the realm of spiritual assessment because of its introduction of this idea of embodiment, of using your own feelings as a means of assessment, and also embodying a role, one of these three roles of truth teller, guide, or value and community, in terms of coming up with how you're going to work with people. And the technique of self-composed custom prayers gives them a way of expressing the needs and concerns in the story that they hear from the Mileveh. And the shared hopes approach that I've expressed is a potential solution. It's an approach that I think reflects better the unpredictable and highly dynamic, real life nature of the spiritual caregiver's work, by conceiving of all the steps in what we do as all the steps, contact, assessment, plan, interventions, evaluation, as going on simultaneously in an ongoing way. And it is the image of prayer, continuous prayer, and of being prayerful that can unify all these steps in one and make them part of a spiritual practice. So that's Sof Pasuk. So Sheilot.
Alan, I think one of the points you made is very significant, among others, that to take note of what we're feeling in our own body. How am I reacting to this patient? And that may give me, the chaplain, or whoever the chaplain is, a clue as to what is the patient doing. Why would I be feeling the way I feel in reaction to this patient? What about the patient caused me to feel that way? And that might be one way of getting a look at where the patient's coming from, just by being conscious of how that patient is affecting you. And you made that point. I think it was a well-made point. I'm just trying to re-emphasizing it.
Yeah, I find that a particularly helpful thing about this AIM framework. I think there's probably a lot of good work to be done about thinking more about how we can use our knowledge of our own feelings, our own reactions, but I really feel like they advanced this part of the work that we do a lot, and I think it's very helpful, especially if we're feeling confused or judgmental about our own feelings, or if we feel that we need to, run away from our own feelings, or, just, I shouldn't be feeling this.
But why am I feeling this? What is the patient doing that's prompting me, perhaps, to feel this way? Make a clue about what's going on with the patient.
Yeah.
Hi, Alan. More than a question, I just want to make a comment. First, it was enjoyable, as always. I was missing your lectures and talks. Just want to share with the others here that we have the article, part of it, the table in the article is translated to Hebrew. So if anyone wants it, I can share it with you gladly. Okay.
Oh, Alan, could you send us the source where we could look up that article in English?
Yeah, I can send it, or Alan can send it. We have it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I'm happy if anybody wants to share my my slides.
Can I ask something?
Betach.
It is kind of almost a mantra in studying Livui Ruchani that we say, "En lanu agenda." And the desired outcome that you described is kind of the exact opposite of that. So can you talk about that tension a little bit?
Well, I don't, I guess I wouldn't agree with Ein Lanu agenda. I mean, when I think about, I have taught Ein Lanu agenda, but I think that's that's an important principle for people who, are starting out in Livui Ruchani, because that's the first really, really big, hard task is becoming aware. The first really big hard task in growing to be a Milah Ruchani is becoming aware of the difference between our agenda and the Mitupal's agenda, and being able to know which one is more important. Obviously, the Mitupal's agenda is more important, and one of the biggest problems that people who are beginning in our field face is that they want to tell their own story and say, "Oh, I went through the same thing." And so, when we're dealing with people who are at the beginning of their careers, as educators, when we're dealing with people at the beginning of our careers, we spend a lot of time trying to teach Ein Lanu agenda, because it's such an important first step. But as we work to become more advanced, more professional, more skillful as Milavim Ruchani, we want to be able to form plans. We want to be able to succeed in holding in tension, our agenda and the agenda of the Mitubal. And it also depends on what you mean by agenda. If what you mean by agenda is what is good for me personally, well then, obviously you need to put that aside. But there's a difference between that and forming a professional plan based on an assessment. So it's a more advanced level of skill to be able to, realize that, I have this agenda that I've formed, professionally, and there's also this agenda that the mitubal has, and they both exist, and I can hold them both. I don't have to just do one or the other. So I want to acknowledge the confusion there, because teaching Ein Lanu agenda is so important when we're teaching people who are at the beginning of their journey as Milavim. Like it is so important at the beginning, because that is the big mistake that beginning people make.
But maybe you're saying it's not about me more than Ein Lanu agenda.
Well, it's definitely not about me.
Yes.
But I would like to add that if you agree with this, I'm not sure, that when we come into a meeting, before we come with a plan, we want to be without an agenda. In other words, even if we're seeing someone for the third or fourth time, we know that we've assessed some things, but we should come in the beginning and see what's happening then and there, and then see if our agenda is still applicable. In other words, not to come in with the agenda before we come in without it, and then we see if it's עדכני, if it's מתאים למפגש הזה.
Yeah, I would agree that we need to come into each encounter in some sense fresh, but we can enter with hopes and intentions. And this is part of the reason why I like the language of tikva, of hopes, as opposed to desired outcomes. It's okay to walk into a person's room and say, to say to yourself in your head, maybe even to say a prayer before you go to yourself, before you go into an encounter, that I hope that today I'll be able to talk to this person about the pain from the child they lost. It's okay to hope for that, if you think that's appropriate. But you're right that if that's not how things go, that you would be wrong to push that on the person. It's a balance. It's a balance. It's walking a tightrope or on a wall.
I think it's what you say. It's about the using of self. You're not supposed to put yourself as the subject, but you're always using yourself, because you're whole and you are using the way you speak and your ideas and your points of view and your values. It's always use of self. So as you mentioned, if you are intersubjective, you exist too. You don't make yourself as an object, as same as you don't make the patients as an object.
Yeah, I'd agree that we're always using ourself. We can't not use ourself, and part of our growth, as Milavim, is to gain greater awareness and control over how we use ourself. But we're always using ourselves, because we're always who we are. We always live in the bodies that we live in. We always carry in all of the experience and history that we had before.
I like the idea that the prayer not it's not something that closes the meeting. It's not like you prepare for leaving, that we talked about 40 minutes or an hour, and that now I pray and then I leave. That you hold the prayer like an energy to gisha. It's like that you put your heart as a prayer along all the meetings. And that you don't have to say a prayer to be a prayer. It's like you come as prayer for someone.
I like that image, that you come as prayer.
Like Heschel said that when he was walking with Martin Luther King, his feet were praying.
Right.
Your whole self. It's not just...
That's right. Very nice.
Alan, I have an illustration. I don't know if it would be useful for me to offer an illustration of something that a good point that you made. I had a lady in a nursing home whose husband was sent off to the hospital, and it was clear he was not going to make it back alive. But her agenda was to feel good. That's all that mattered to her, that she should feel good. She wanted, when she received truthful information from the social worker about how her husband was doing over at the hospital, she was very unhappy with that. So I found that her agenda was to feel good. I had a conflicting agenda, but I wanted to meet her agenda as well as mine. So I would come in and I would give her selected information about how her husband was doing at the hospital, the information that she could use if she wanted to use it to feel good. But at the same time, I had the agenda that he's not gonna make it but a few days. So part of my agenda was to bring her to a point where she's gonna be able to deal with the truth that at first, right now, she doesn't want to hear. So there was a little bit of a duel or conflict in her agenda and mine, but I had to make my agenda work with hers. And it worked. By, as I say, giving her the information that she could use the way she wanted to use it. And eventually she got to the point where she was able to deal with the real information when he died, that he died.
Well, that sounds a bit, the image of a dance came to mind as you were speaking. Yeah. It sounds like you were in a little bit of a dance with her, trying to go with her as far as, as far as she was able to go, when she was ready.
Yeah.
רציתי להגיד תודה רבה, אלן, זה היה מאוד מעניין. אני צריכה לפרוש, אז רק רציתי להגיד ממש תודה רבה.
תודה. יישר כוח, אלן. Good session.
תודה.
Thanks, Tova and Dina, for arranging it.
Unmute. I wanted to say that before we say goodbye, does anybody have any other questions or any other comments or So, Alan, would you like to say anything before we part, before I thank you? B'shem kulanu.
Just thanks to everybody for your time, and thanks to especially to Dina and Tova for organizing.
So, in the name of all of us, I want to thank you for very interesting and kind of making order in a new light, and for the opportunity of learning with you again. We haven't done that in a long time in a group manner. And hoping this is the beginning of a relationship and more learning together, that the Amutah can benefit from your experience and knowledge. And thank you very much.
Okay. תודה
תודה
רבה.
רבה. ערב טוב לכולם.
ערב טוב.
תודה רבה רבה, אלן. ותודה דינה וטובה על כל הארגון, וככה ההשקעה, ככה המנטננס של זה. זה ממש חשוב ומקסים שאתם מחזיקות את זה.
יופי. אנחנו מקווים שיהודית רוזנברג תהיה הדמות הבאה שתחלוק מניסיונה. אנחנו עוד לא דייקנו את הנושא, אבל ברגע שנדייק אותו, נשלח יידוע ואז תזכורת בקישורים. אז שיהיה שבוע טוב לכולנו, ולהתראות, נהיה בקשר.
להתראות.
דינה?
ביי ביי.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה, אלן, תודה רבה.
ביי.
ביי.